Welcome to the Pockington History and Politics podcast. I'm Callum Braywood, and this week I'm joined by Gareth Hughes, as ever.
Hello.
Looking dapper. What is that behind you, that wallpaper?
Well, you know, this has been a runaway success, this podcast. Well, now, we've been away for a few weeks, obviously. We're back. Part of the reason we've been away is due to the proceeds, the profits made from this podcast, I've been able to move house. So here we are, live, well, not live, recorded from Friday Thorpe with some dazzling wallpaper. Whoa.
It's very dazzling indeed. Dazzling indeed. Also joined by apparently Graham Hughes, but I think it's Anna Hughes, and Jonathan Webb again. Two fine contenders in our World Cup of PMs who will be battling it out in the final. Look very happy to be here, both of them. Sunday afternoon. So happy. Just a reminder, no effing and jeffing, and robust banter is absolutely fine, of course. So just to give you an insight into what's coming up over the next couple of weeks, we've got some bonus material coming your way. We've got the finale of our Student Mastermind Challenge, which is going to be the four highest scorers battling it out in a House of Game style competition, which will be with you in the next couple of weeks. And of course, today we've got what we've all been waiting for, which is the final. But before we start, have we got any historical facts of the day?
I've got a few.
Go for it, Mr. Hughes.
So, politically wise, there's a good one. 1835, Lord Melbourne became Prime Minister on this day after the resignation of Robert Peel. We've mentioned those Prime Ministers in the past. Today is also the anniversary of the death of Albert Einstein on this day in 1955. I think it's also, although this one I might be wrong, I think I'm right, this is the anniversary of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, I think, today as well. I think that's true. I think that's accurate. Really big cultural ones, though, here. 1985, Wham! Become the first Western pop act to release an album in China. And on this day, in 2018, Black Panther is the first film shown at commercial cinema in Saudi Arabia for 35 years.
Very good. I mean, I did see those on my research this morning. So I'm glad
isn't it?
I picked some different ones. Amazingly. Why do we always talk about Paul Revere? Paul Revere seems to make it into this podcast, every other podcast. And
him and Spencer Percival.
I know, it's
always
crazy.
In.
Especially as that museum was so bad.
Mm.
It was one of the worst experiences of my life. That's probably going.
Well, that's going a bit too far.
That's going a bit too far. I think it was more the fear that a terror attack was taking place just outside.
Just outside, but it wasn't. It
wasn't. Absolutely fine. The students were completely safe. So I've got a couple of facts. On this day, which is the 18th of April in 1881, the Natural History Museum in London opened up.
Nice.
Interesting. Great little trip out there. On this day in 1912, the Carpathia brought 705 survivors from the Titanic to New York after it had sunk on the 15th of April.
Oh, wow.
But my favourite one is in 1968, oil tycoon Robert McCulloch bought London Bridge for £1 million. Now, he actually built what was the new London Bridge that had been built in 1831 because it was gradually sinking into the Thames. And instead of just removing it and then putting up a new one, they decided to auction it off. And he just, there was really no competition, and he just kept inflating the price anyway, so it was absolutely fine. And you can now go and see it on Lake Havasu in Arizona in the US.
Let's go.
So is the world's largest antique, technically, as well.
Did he never complain that he got the wrong one? Because he believed he was buying the other one, didn't he?
Is that a myth?
There is an urban legend that he was, he thought he was buying Tower Bridge because there was a big kind of publicity campaign to try and sell London Bridge. But the kind of London authorities, when they were asked about it, they went, no, he knew what he was buying. He knew he was buying London Bridge. But I thought that until I did a little bit of research on that this morning as well. That would be a shock, wouldn't it? Because you just get this kind of quite dull looking bridge. It's not even the medieval London Bridge where there are shops on it and things like that. It was just the stone sort of edifice. So there we go. A few facts for the day.
Lovely.
I think it's over to you, Mr. Hughes, to...
Yeah, I'll set the scene a little bit. So, I mean, at this point, I would share my screen, but you'll probably realise I'm on an iPad here. The problem with the house move is, for some reason, my computer's decided to die. Now, I was thinking back, it's been a long journey, a very long journey to reach this final. And obviously, Johnny Webb is absolutely delighted to still be here with us in the final, as is Anna. I think Anna's a bit happier to have made it through. I think
done my best not to be here.
And every time you've made it. Anna with glorious victories over Tom Verinder in the quarterfinal. And then there was that battle of the alumni in the semi-finals against Martin Davis. And Johnny Webb beat Alberta, Paul Bennett. And then, in probably one of the big shocks, defeated the giant Phil Donaldson in the semi-final and has made it to the final. And remember, if you went with your original prime ministers, this would have been a final of Stanley Baldwin versus Marquis of Salisbury. Now, I'd be interested to hear who we've both gone for, because remember the wild card. The wild card was, in the final, you can choose to ditch and twist if you like. So you could have chosen a prime minister who has not been used so far in the tournament. So, Anna, who have you gone for?
I have gone for David Lloyd George.
Good pick.
The Welsh Wizard.
Welsh Wizard.
I did a bit of research into, who voting for the top ones. And once I got rid of Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher, I was left with Lloyd George, and he seemed quite an interesting character. So I had done a bit of research on Baldwin, but Lloyd George definitely trumps him.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good. I think it should be really interesting to hear that. There's all sorts of stuff I'd like to discuss about Lloyd George. So yeah, be interested to see your take on it. Mr. Webb, who have you gone for?
Well, in a desperate bid to lose in every round, I tend to go obscure and even more obscure. So every single time I go back in time. So I'm quite proud of not going beyond 1850 and going for some of these popular 19th and 20th century prime ministers. So I went from Grey to Pitt, and now I've gone right back to the 1720s, a period I've spent a huge amount of time studying, and I've gone for the first Earl of Oxford, Robert Walpole.
Yeah, Walpole's made it in. So it's a final between David Lloyd George and Walpole. That is a quality final.
No one would have predicted that, would they? If we'd done it in a different form, if you'd done it in any other format, you couldn't have predicted that.
Lloyd George,
actually,
just do it. Go on, sorry.
There's an interesting historical fact about Stanley Baldwin, don't you?
Go on.
Because he was at Harrow, and he was caught in the boys' toilets with compromising material by his housemaster, and he was so embarrassed that he thought, well, okay, when I get into the sixth form, I'll go into one of the sixth form Harrow houses. And when he became a sixth former, that's sort of the equivalent to whatever it was in those days, his housemaster was promoted to headmaster. So he never escaped him. And then he went to university, of course, famously, of course, went to Trinity College, Cambridge. And his headmaster was appointed the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He never escaped him.
No way. I love that. That's great.
It's a little bit like, the Earl of Oxford that apparently, genuflecting in front of Elizabeth I let out an emission of air from the bottom. And so he was so ashamed that he left court for about 30 years. And when he returned, the first thing Elizabeth said, my Lord of Oxford, I had forgot the fart. That's about the best story I know about Stanley Baldwin.
That's great. That's
what I'm here for. For on a Sunday morning, that's what I'm here for. Compromising material and farts.
I'm in that kind of mood.
Shall we get this show on the road and do the final?
Please, God, do, yes.
Right. So I believe first up will be Anna, and you have a maximum of 10 minutes. Don't have to use them all, but a maximum of 10 minutes. I'll give you the usual 2-minute and 1-minute warning. So your 10 minutes on David Lloyd George. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Begin now.
Okay, so David Lloyd George, born in Manchester but brought up in Wales, idolised his shoemaker uncle He was a nonconformist himself, and I think that plus his idea of independence and being Welsh, his core values, I think, were really shaped in his early days. He saw the little people as important, and independence as a country, independence as his own church from the oppression of those that had wealth or those that wielded power. And I think this really drove him in many of the decisions that he made throughout his career, even before Prime Minister. So in his first job as a solicitor, he helped to create a monthly paper called the Udgorn Ryddid, the Bugle of Freedom in Welsh. And I think he trumpeted that loudly, and he played it throughout his time as well in his ideals too, this idea of freedom from many different things. So as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1909, he was driven to, in his words, lift the shadow of the workhouse from the homes of the poor. And one of the first things he did was to argue against the military expenditure, the arms race between Britain and Germany for more battleships, wanting to move from 6 to 4. But he was defeated by the "we want 8 and we won't wait" brigade. Rather than feeling defeated, he shifted his focus to another cause, and he went on to demand and to suggest that if there was that much money for arms, then there should be an equivalent amount for welfare. He was very fond of the German example of national insurance, and he declared that we should not emulate them only in armaments. And this was his first idea of really socially helping the people around him. So some of the things he facilitated as well were to bring schools under local educational authorities, although he was a little bit unhappy with this because he didn't like the idea of the state paying for church schools, his nonconformist ideas coming to the fore there. He made education compulsory for 14 to 15-year-olds. He doubled teachers' pay. He tripled their pensions in order to ensure great teaching. He enabled house building. He provided allotment land. He made improvements to suffrage. And most importantly, going on the Lloyd George, national insurance, national health insurance, sick and infirm pay, assistance for the blind, old age pensions. All of these were his ideas, and all of these were brought forward and taken on at that time. He also managed to smooth negotiations. He was a very skilled orator and negotiator between unions and employers. And this we'll come back to again later, the way he was able to smooth over ideas and keep people happy, I suppose, in both of the areas. So many actually said that his national insurance and his pension system prevented in Britain many of the revolutions that were seen all over Europe. And it actually gave us the strength and solidity we needed to win the war and to move forward in ways that maybe other European countries weren't able to. But these changes were costly, financially and politically for him. And his liberalism and socialism were quite frightening to some of the ruling classes in which he worked. His Limehouse speech, famously denouncing the Conservatives and wealthy classes, he said, "Who made 10,000 people owners of the soil and the rest of us trespassers in the land of our birth?" And his way of raising money, 20% tax on unearned increase in land value, raising income tax, super tax on high estates, were obviously popular with many, but feared by those most impacted and most wealthy and most powerful. So his influence in the war, though, began before his position as Prime Minister. He was very pro-German initially and was very reluctant to be involved, very cautious in a way. And he said, "I would make great sacrifices to preserve peace," and did carry on this role all the way through his prime ministership. But he did also argue, on the other hand, that Britain was anything but a spectator and was fully invested when the, as he called it, small nationality of Belgium announced its resistance to German egress, or against Woodrow Wilson's mediation suggestion. He said, "The fight must be to the finish." In 1915, Asquith created a coalition, Liberal-led, Conservative and Labour, and Lloyd George was made Minister of Munitions, and he instantly took control. He centralised industrial department and arms production, taking that power away from the generals, so the generals were no longer responsible for it. He created the Ministry of Shipping, also bringing that under state control. And in 1916, he was created as the Secretary of State for War. But he was constantly frustrated, even though he was able to do all these grandiose schemes and to bring these things into play that have massive impacts then and still today, and certainly during the Second World War. But he was frustrated at this point by his limited power and his constant clashes over strategy. He was always somebody who needed to be right at the heart of the matter and very involved in the situation. But Asquith was struggling. He was struggling with a stalemate on the Western Front. He was struggling with support, and he resigned. Lloyd George then became Prime Minister, and instantly he had that power. He had that ability to make the changes he wanted to change. So he improved the war cabinet. He made a new cabinet office. He introduced convoy systems, rationing. He bigged up conscription, made it important for the whole country. He said, you cannot run a war as you would a Sunday school treat. One volunteer brings the buns, another the tea, and a third the kettle. Next, he began to create the strategic benefits he felt that were lacking under war generals such as Haig. He was sickened by the number of casualties for such narrow strategic gains. He said in his war memoirs in 1938, when the Great War broke out, our generals had the most important of their art to learn. Before that, they had much to unlearn. Their brains were cluttered with useless limber, packed in every niche and corner. So he belittled his generals, but also set about making some useful and very, very rewarding changes to their behaviour. So he advocated centralised leadership of the Allies, putting Foch as the Supreme War Council head, going against the views of his other commanders as well. He extended conscription to Wales and Ireland. He said, in the end, we will march through terror to triumph. And in 1918, he was able to send 500,000 soldiers to France and asked Woodrow Wilson for support. So we won the war. The war was won. He rode that popularity. In 1918 as well, survived Spanish flu. Post-war, he was still a key figure, certainly in Paris at Versailles, preaching generosity and moderation. He detested Clemenceau, but saw Woodrow Wilson as too lenient and forgiving. He said, I was seated between Jesus Christ, Wilson, and Napoleon Bonaparte, Clemenceau. And the next coupon election, he was still promising Britain for the British, rehabilitation for those broken in war, and a happier country for all. And due to his social changes, due to his national insurance, and due to his, as many would see as quite detailed meddling, he was able to provide all of these things. He maintained the coalition. He was riding his post-war euphoric wave, whilst his social reforms supported the wounded coming back from war. His early negotiation with unions and his understanding for a drive for independence also allowed him to right the wrongs of the Easter Rising against first conscription and then the failed policing of the black and tans.
2 minutes.
Finally able to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty on the 20th of July, separating the North and South and granting a free state. So was he master of peace in the world? Well, the end was nigh. There were strikes, economic downturn. He maintained the naval blockade in Germany, allowing the starvation of the people he once admired. The alleged insider trading of the Marconi affair, selling lucrative peerages, lukewarm League of Nations, infighting about the self-government of India, and the increased disfranchisement of the press, the coalition and leaders championing conscription, but categorically not allowing his son Gwilym to enlist. His own infidelity, war profiteering, a presidential style of leadership, distrust in his own commanders, failures and scandals. The Conservatives left the coalition. Lloyd George knew that he was doomed and resigned. He didn't take the peerage offered to him, probably because that would have been slightly hypocritical since he was selling them anyway, or serve in his protege Winston Churchill's cabinet in 1940. He's buried in Llanlys Stwmdwy beside the River Dwyfor, no inscription at all, very quietly. He wanted to create a country fit for heroes to live in. I believe that he did this and more. His core values prompted great acts of social change and victory. The things he created in wartime were the bedrock of strategies in World War II. His legacy reaches towards us even now in national health, national insurance and pensions. But his friend Lord Northcliffe said he could not stand comradeship in any enterprise. He only appreciated work when he was the captain of the team. He was the master of the grandiose scheme, but not a man for the details. But I believe that these flaws also made his successes. He needed to blow his own bugle of freedom to rise above traditional enterprise and to grasp the reins to make necessary change. He succeeded in both wartime and peacetime, unlike Churchill. And the policies he created shape our world in every decade past and even today. His grandiose schemes were and are still incredible, and that is why he should be the top trumps of prime ministers.
Oh, hey,
Very good.
excellent, good start. Well done, very, very good. That was excellent, really interesting.
Got my vote.
Should we just end it there then?
If possible, yes.
Just beginning to research the man, there's so much that I haven't even put in there. There's just so much to include. I mean, I know that, you know, Winston Churchill would be a difficult one to do, but I believe that, you know, Lloyd George had as many positives as few negatives, but ultimately, you know, the things that he did still resonate today. And he was a good man.
Yeah, it's I thought, obviously I knew Lloyd George might be one of the choices that came out, and I started reading last night on him and ended up spending a lot of time actually his time after Prime Minister, which is obviously not particularly useful for this discussion, but it was interesting to see there's this assumption that at some point he would definitely return to power, and obviously he never did. But if you look at, it's this long-running feud with Asquith, the Asquith Liberals and the Lloyd George Liberals, and obviously one of the legacies of Lloyd George is the split and then ultimate, not destruction, but marginalisation of the Liberal Party for decades. Yet when you read about him, I'm not going to remember the years, is it late 20s when he's back as a leader of the Liberal Party, maybe early 30s? That's when they say ideas returned to the Liberal Party, which I thought was really interesting. And he turned down that, yeah, as you mentioned, he turned down that position in the coalition. And I think, am I right in thinking it'd be just simply because he didn't get on with somebody else who was going to be in the coalition? I can't quite remember who. But it was, as you mentioned, it was the personal. And he needed to be in charge. He needed to have power. He needed to see that he was helping to direct that ship. And when he clashed with personalities, he didn't want to work with them.
You can see that a lot of the decisions he made were entirely down to the fact that he wanted that detail and he wanted that control, but he actually didn't want to bother with actually working out how these things were going to happen, just that he wanted them to happen. And he didn't, although he had a lot of trusted people that, like Fisher with all the educational reforms, but there were very few people that he seemed to trust to actually bring his ideas forward. So he was very much quite a controlled person. I mean, a brilliant person, but not somebody who worked with people well.
There's that constant theme about support, welfare support, sort of politics for all, education for all. What fascinates me was how he had this massive portfolio of investments after he'd left office. I think in today's money, it was something like 150 million pounds worth of wealth, which again is interesting.
Yeah, he liked his money. He definitely did. He did like his money, but I think this, you know, the idea of being the Welshman and the independence, and I think there's a lot of drive there. Being a non-conformist in a world, you know, strongly controlled by the Church of England, I think there's a lot of fight there built in from when he's young, isn't there, to push forward these ideas and to support, as I said at the beginning, the little people, the Belgians, you know, the Boers. Actually, there's a big part about the Boer War I didn't talk about as well. So
we could spend hours talking about his relationship with Haig, but maybe.
I know I didn't go into enough detail, but as you can see, it barely fits it in.
Gareth, would you say that is the reason that Haig was and still is, in the popular kind of opinion, much maligned because of the memoirs of Lloyd George? He went to war with him in the memoirs, didn't he?
He did.
Rewrite history in some respects.
Yeah, he did, but I still feel, you know, Haig is still very popular in the 1920s back home. I think when you have to do that combination, don't you? You have to combine those memoirs with what happened in subsequent decades in the 60s and the anti-war feeling, and then obviously your Blackadder 80s style stuff. But yes, they go to war over legacy, definitely. And it's one of the big. I wish I'd done more research on it before this, but one of the big issues, I'm sure, isn't it because Lloyd George supports the doomed Nivelle offensive? That's one of the big problems, and then has to back Haig's 1917 plans, and that's one of the major fault lines in their relationship.
Yeah, but but that's quite interesting when you talk about 1917, talk about Third Eve and Passchendaele. One of the reasons it didn't continue on, even though tactically they couldn't have continued on was because he stopped them from on through the mud from into November, December to January of 1918. He was holding back, wasn't he, Haig, and the resources even at that point as well. Another thing interesting about Haig, looking at Lloyd George after his time as Prime Minister, is his thoughts on appeasement as well. He was a big supporter of Hitler for some time. He obviously changed, he came round, but Hitler loved the fact that he went over to Germany, met him, spoke to him, admired him, and played much on that as this kind of First World War Prime Minister. It was some kind of heroic figure in British politics at the time. So it's interesting to look at that. I'm not.
Yeah, and he was. I think it was during the Battle of Britain. He was writing openly for a negotiated peace. He was very much in that early stage of the war, wanting a negotiated peace, an agreement with Germany. He genuinely felt we couldn't win that war.
One of the best things that I actually looked up was Spartacus Educational. So if anybody wants to read any more about him, that was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, Spartacus Education has been around for ages. It's an absolute classic resource. It's great.
So good, but it also has all his speeches, and it has people talking about him. It's just, you want to read one thing quickly and to get an idea of him. It's brilliant.
Brilliant stuff.
Excellent. Right. So, step up, Mr. Jonathan Webb. We're going to learn all about Walpole.
Are you?
Here's our Walpole expert. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's begin.
Shall we start?
Yeah, go.
Oh my word. How long have I got? 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Oh my word. Right. I'll try and fill 5. Well, no, actually. No, Robert Walpole, interesting character, actually. First Earl of Oxford. I suppose on a simplistic level, he was the first ever Prime Minister. Prime Minister means first, so he was first of the first. And in my book, that means he's the best. Well, okay, so, that's possibly a simplistic interpretation. But I suppose if you ask any man or woman in the mean streets and dark alleyways of Pocklington about Robert Walpole, you're likely to get rather a quizzical look and possibly even hostility for interrupting their Sunday afternoon. And even the genteel highways of Ripon, you might get a nodding acquaintance that Walpole was a British politician, but probably little more. And to be fair, you can understand this because essentially the 18th century has been taken off any school syllabus. Anybody teach 18th century history now? I hear a deafening silence. I hear a deafening silence. Well, possibly. So most people's working knowledge of the 18th century is pretty limited to a vague understanding of men in wigs. That's hairpieces. Excessive drinking of port. Think about Pitt. Gout. Women sporting grotesque beauty spots, and a sort of a romanticized conception of Cornwall round about the time of Poldark. And of course, which I know is right towards the end of the 18th century, of course, the sobriquets of the time hardly encourage a sense of curiosity. The age of gentility, the age of stability, the Whig supremacy. Yes, this was a time of ordered hierarchy with noblemen living in their Palladian stately homes, contented yeoman farmers working on their newly enclosed land, and honest tin miners. Even the Industrial Revolution had not really troubled England at this time. So it's hardly surprising to know that few people have really heard of Walpole, and even if they have been aware, they are probably unaware that he is Britain's longest serving Prime Minister, and of course the first minister to hold that position of Prime Minister. So where does his greatness lie? Now, at this point, I normally start talking about how many children they've fathered. And I did look this up on Walpole. He did father 5 by his first wife, and 1 by his second wife, who was also his mistress, I believe, for a large period of his first marriage. But I did find, actually, that he was the fifth child in a family of 19 children.
Whoa. Good word.
So that beats his father beats Earl Grey, who had 16, of course. But let's move on, because we need to think about the politics and his prime ministership. But before we do that, again, I do need to apply my usual historical contextual understanding. Walpole was no Democrat. He was no National Socialist like Lloyd George. He was no human rights activist. He held shares in the South Sea Company, of course, whose trading activities included slave trading. Walpole was regularly re-elected from the rottenest of boroughs of King's Lynn. So really, yes, on those scores, we can dismiss him. He was a man of his time, and I think we need to appreciate the cultural relativism of those times too. So who was Walpole? Well, he came from, I suppose, aspirant gentry stock, and he was a Whig. And I suppose, one of the first liberals. And the Whigs, of course, as we all know, having studied our 18th century history, stood for the rights of the Commons, the rights of Parliament, against the tendencies of monarchical absolutism. And as such, therefore, he is absolutely pivotal as Britain's first prime minister, the very epicenter, the crux of this move away from monarchical absolutism, king's government to parliamentary government. This was an age, of course, when parties were in their infancy, and it's not sensible to see him as a Whig prime minister forming a Whig administration. Prior to becoming prime minister in 1721, he had worked under Tory administrations, or sort of a coalition, if you like, a shifting coalition of Whigs and Tories. The Tories, of course, stood historically, of course, for the Jacobin succession of James II. He worked within those administrations, but in 1721 he formed a largely wholly Whig government. So prior to that, there had been a period of financial corruption involving something called the South Sea Bubble, and Walpole had one of his first tasks really was to sort out the financial mess. So in 1721, George I turns to him and asks him to become not just the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which I think had been a post he'd held beforehand, but also leader of the Commons and, crucially, First Lord of the Treasury. And it's holding those three jobs together, nobody else had done that before, that essentially gives him this title, Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of his day. And of course, even now, Boris Johnson's official title is First Lord of the Treasury. And so if you look on the door of number 10 Downing Street, of course, that's the title that's there. He rejected the title Prime Minister, First Minister, but it was one which stuck. And over time, he became, he accepted that in his long tenure as 21 years as Prime Minister of Great Britain. So what were his achievements? Considerable, absolutely considerable. So first of all, he dealt with the financial fallout of the South Sea Bubble. He established on a sound footing the financial basis of the Bank of England. He foiled a Jacobite plot to restore James Stuart, the old pretender, of course, and he settled peace with France and Germany. So really under Walpole, I think that the key success of his time was that Britain became peaceful and prosperous and free of crises. And it's possibly a little bit overblown to sort of suggest, like that famous historian of the 18th century, of course, I hear you all cry, John Plum, Jack Plum, that Walpole built essentially the stability of England upon which the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire was founded. However, he did definitely contribute towards that peace and stability of the early 18th century. His main success, really, I think, therefore, was the avoidance of war. He hated war. Of course, famously, he once said that I think there'd been a conflict between France and Spain, and he'd said, 50,000 Frenchmen lie dead and no Englishmen. And that was his overarching aim, to avoid war. And that brought great popularity in the country. He advised George II against entering the War of the Polish Succession in 1733. Financially, he was very astute. He lowered taxes. He reduced the national debt. He shifted taxes away from land taxes towards customs and excise wisely. Was that 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Blimey, better speed up. I've got pages to go. Such is the greatness of this man. Including wine and tobacco. How visionary was that to start taxing wine and tobacco? Terrible. Of course, he also tried to tax gin, and that led to various gin riots. One thinks of Gorbachev's policy on vodka, of course, in the 1980s, equally ill-advised, possibly, but right in its intentions, of course. Now, his downfall did come by the late 1930s. His great protector was Queen Caroline, and towards the end of his reign, his opposition to war actually became unpopular. People began to want a good old war with the Spanish, who were attacking British shipping in the Caribbean, and this, of course, famously led to that war, which I've always been intrigued to find out about, was the War of Jenkins' Ear. When some merchant had his ear lopped off by some dastardly Spaniard on a ship in the Caribbean. But by the end, by the early 1740s, by the 1741 election, he lost a lot of support. The Tories had gained mainly in the pocket boroughs, so his Whig supporters were successful in the popular boroughs. But eventually, the shift in the Commons moved against him, and a vote of no confidence led to his resignation. Exhausted, he died 3-4 years later. So, to wrap up, Walpole, what a hero! First Prime Minister, 21 years in office, hugely influential. Resided in the Commons throughout his time. He resisted movement into the House of Lords, kept England out of war, enriched the nation, established the Protestant ascendancy. I'm not necessarily that's a positive thing religiously, but of course ended the Jacobite challenge, and really the defeat of Boniface Charlie in 1745 was built on that financial stability that he had created. Yes, he was subject to a huge number of attacks from his enemies. He was an honourable man, a man of parliament, rather coarse in his wit, but a great and brilliant administrator. And of course, finally, the mark of the man. I always finish on the mark of the man. When gifted 10 Downing Street as a private residence by the king, he said, no, this will become the official residence of the First Lord of the Admiralty. 10 Downing Street, maybe not his greatest legacy, but an important one nevertheless. There we are. Remarkable man, actually.
Excellent.
Don't know much about him, but a remarkable man. Don't ask me any questions.
I'm not going to pretend to know much about Walpole, but the one thing that struck me when I was reading beforehand was exactly the point you just made about peacetime, commitment to keeping peace, and how that, interestingly, towards the end became negative. That was really fascinating. And he really hated the Prime Minister name initially, didn't he? So it was used as a real slur against him.
He ended up in the Tower for 6 months.
Did he?
Yeah, he was imprisoned on corruption charges before he became Prime Minister.
Wow. Now, I don't know I did read that it was associated with a number of corruptions, which he's always been open up to that criticism. And didn't he sell the South Sea bubble? The South Sea bubble, though, didn't he sell his shares at the height? So he made a vast fortune out of it. Yeah.
And that's how he was able to build Houghton Hall, which is his great sort of Palladian residence, because he sold right at the top of the bubble, and then the whole thing crashed. And then spent his premiership sorting the whole thing out and arresting and imprisoning various speculators, even though he was probably one of the chief speculators. But at least he wasn't involved in cash for honours scandals like Lloyd George.
Oh, gloves are coming off now.
What's the whole issue with gin? Was that linked to, is it Hogarth's paintings of the deprivation in cities, and gin being the main driver of that? Is that why?
Yeah, I think
gin.
Yeah, I don't know enough about him, to be honest, to detect a puritanical stream, but I think he was against excessive alcohol consumption, and that's part of the reason for taxing alcohol. And of course, I suppose because so much of it was sold, it was probably an easy way to raise money as well. But every single chancellor ever since has relied on the sin taxes, haven't they, to raise simple revenue, easy quick win revenue.
Yeah, Lloyd George
And of
did
course-
it as well.
Yeah, and Gorbachev famously tried to do it, didn't he, in the 1980s, in 1986, 87. It was absolutely disastrous because, of course, everybody turned to the moonshine stuff, didn't it? The sort of homebrew.
Yeah.
With the gin, there's something, I'm not going to remember it, but because of that, because of the problems with gin, it was so heavily regulated that was it about 10 years ago that Parliament finally sort of removed this really strict requirement on who could make gin, which is why we've had such an explosion in independent gin making. There's an act of Parliament very recently, the last 10 years, that's allowed this to happen. I'd have to look
I
it
don't
up,
know about
but it does link back. It was doing something to, I'm sure it was repealing part of an 18th century law.
Yeah,
Yes, there's an artist called Hogarth. If you have a look at his paintings, they're all about the problems with alcoholism and society, and there's this gin-soaked woman dangling her baby over a river, and
yeah, seen that one.
it's interesting, this link between kind of progressivism, taxation, and alcohol. I think back to prohibition in America. One of the key reasons it's passed is because of the 16th Amendment. They needed to find taxation from somewhere else. So you get the income tax passed through the championing of Taft, and then you get the prohibition. It's easier to pass because you're not relying on it for revenue, and that's one of the kind of progressive planks to use in trying to get prohibition passed. Almost an unintended consequence of it.
Nice.
There is it strikes me that so I was reading the BBC History magazine, and Anthony Seldon is doing a series of podcasts or radio programs on Radio 4 to mark 300 years of the Prime Minister in Britain. I think he's writing a book alongside it as well. And obviously he talks about Walpole in there, and the idea that was that the term Prime Minister was very much a derogatory term at the time as well. But he raises a point: how similar is the Prime Minister of Walpole's day to the Prime Minister of today? They share the same title. Ultimately, in sharing that title of First Lord of the Treasury, they have that important role to play for the nation's finances, to look after it as well. Mm-hmm. But I wonder how similar Walpole is to Johnson in terms of what they have to do, in terms of some of the challenges they have to face as well. I don't have a simple answer to that, but it's a really interesting article. So BBC History magazine, all about the 300 years on. And he's got a number of questions he asks as well. And he doesn't believe, Anthony Seldon, in the idea of trying to find the best prime minister. He says there's different types of prime ministers. There's the agenda setters. There's the people who change the role of prime minister as well. There's the noble failures, for example, and so on. So it's a really interesting article that I happened to just read this morning accidentally.
Well, there we have it then. That is the final. And so we haven't done it for a while. Obviously, like and subscribe, guys, and do all of that stuff. Now, in the next couple, get on Twitter, vote for who you want to win. Is it Jonathan Webb with Walpole, or is it Anna Hughes with David Lloyd George, and bring this epic tournament to a conclusion? Boom.
You say a conclusion. There is going to be bonus material where you can.
Yeah. That's the like after hours, extra stuff.
Editor's cut.
Editor's cut, yeah. DVD extras.
Gareth, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What happened to the playoff?
Well, the playoff will occur, but it's going to be part of the bonus material.
Marketing trick, eh?
Yeah, exactly that.
So we've got, as ever, a book recommendation. We might get more book recommendations as well, but I've gone for a book I've read over the Easter holidays, which is by Philippe Sands, who is an international lawyer, great writer as well. And I've gone for The Rat Line, which is all about the Nazi fugitives after the Second World War, and they're trying to escape to South America or to Syria. And it looks at the family of a guy called Vactor and his son basically trying to come to terms with having a Nazi as a dad. His father was kind of governor of Krakow, was implicated heavily in the Holocaust, but the son struggles to come to terms with that. And it's Philippe Sands looking at the history, looking at the archives of this family, going on a bit of a personal kind of tour as well, because a lot of his family died in the Holocaust as well. It's genuinely fascinating, and it's kind of a follow-up to his book East-West Street, which I'd recommend as well. Really fascinating. Nothing to do with prime ministers or politics, but I thought definitely a recommendation from me there. Any other books?
Well, since moving house, I've not really had a chance to read an awful lot in the last couple of weeks, but I am surrounded by books just all on the floor. So I'll just grab 2 or 3 that I can find. Hang on. They're around. Yeah, these are good ones. This is good. So, if you've not read Deep South by Paul Theroux, I'd heavily recommend that. That is a fantastic insight into what it's really like in the Deep South. He travelled, I don't know if you know, do you know Paul Theroux? Do you come across Paul Theroux? So travel writer, obviously Louis Theroux's dad, writes beautiful stuff. Really enjoyed that book. That's the best, probably for me, the best. I don't read a lot of travel writing, but the best one I've ever read is that book. And what else can I find? Here we go. One of my favourite fiction authors, actually, Robert Harris, and his Munich. Munich, this book actually made me reconsider how I think about Neville Chamberlain. It's a really great, I love Robert Harris anyway, everything he writes I read, but that is a high recommendation. All obviously about Munich conference and build up to that, but good book. And then I found an advert for a book that's just on the floor there. So with this, you can get 20% off. So just a little plug there.
Who's that by?
Really talented author. Not heard of him. Gareth Hughes?
No, I haven't either.
Yeah. There we go.
There we go.
Gareth,
Yeah.
can I do a book recommendation from some books I found on the floor as well?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So I found this one. I love this book. Have you come across Stephen Beastie?
That's
Cross-sections.
I had that book when I was a kid. I absolutely loved that book.
These books are amazing, incredible cross sections.
Oh, yes, I have seen that.
This one's called Man of War, which is about the victory, and it's just page after page of cross sections. I love these.
What other ones has he done?
Look at that, sleeping arrangements on the victory. That's a wonderful book. Definitely a wonderful book. Get it in the library. And then completely different. Sarah Raven's brilliant perennials catalogue, which I've just found. It's beautiful. I've just ordered some Hellenians, actually. Absolutely stunning perennials in here. So I shouldn't really be over-advising. And also the David Austin Handbook of Roses. Some absolute crackers in here
Beautiful.
as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Love it.
So there you are. That's my recommendation.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
Oh, and if you like Talisker, this is quite nice as well.
That's for the
Have you
after
been
hours.
drinking that throughout?
No, I'm in my outdoor office. Can you edit that one out, please?
You'll not be atting that, will you? Won't be tweeting this out, will you? At Ripon Headmaster.
No. So I'm incognito.
Anna, anything from you? Any books on the floor you want to share?
Sadly, no books anywhere in this particular room. I'm going to go and read Robert Harris's Munich. That's Robert Harris. It's absolutely amazing writer.
One thing I will say is I didn't enjoy Second Sleep that much.
I loved it,
No, it was
until
weird.
the end.
Still have a good book.
Yeah, I liked it until it got to the end, and I was like, this is just it just felt like it just died. It just like.
And I don't want to be negative about Robert Harris. It's a good book, but it could have been amazing. But anyway.
I'm currently reading this one, which is backwards, obviously, which makes it very difficult to read. But it's The English Civil War by Diane Purkiss. Absolutely brilliant. It's so involved, but she talks about everything from the point of view of the people, and lots of source evidence, but really fantastic to read. You know, it's like a novel. It's wonderful. That's really good.
That kind of narrative history is brilliant stuff, and I'm reading Mark Morris's The Norman Conquest at the moment. It's so good. It's just brilliant in terms of how it weaves narrative history, a good story ultimately, with some analysis and ideas about the source material there is for it as well. It's nice to go back to it because teaching the Norman Conquest, it feels quite easy to do, but actually it's a lot more involved and a lot more interesting than we can kind of do justice to our year sevens, our first years. So really fascinating book there.
Just a little link to Jen. I've just found that, Anna.
Yeah, that's a very good one.
Little present from Anna there.
Have you read it?
I feel like we've become more and more alcohol focused as the episode's gone on here as well.
I wonder why that. What time is it?
It's nearly 1 o'clock.
Excellent. Let's wrap it up and I can go for a beer.
Beckons downstairs. So we've got our, it won't be our final song recommendation, but one of our last song recommendations from Mr. Hughes, as ever. I'm sure YouTube will take off the sound again, but
yeah, definitely.
You can definitely listen along on your own.
Yeah, this was an obvious one to do at some point, and I think we maybe referenced it in an earlier Prime Minister round. But it's not just the song. Now, this is the original sort of party, I don't know if it's part of political broadcast, but campaign video. 1997, things can only get better.
Oh, no.
Can you share it, Mr. Braidwood?
Can I share it? Oh yeah, I have to go to it, don't I?
Yeah, you've got it. I can't do it on here.
Okay, this is gonna be slick as ever. Just need to find it.
It's so cheesy. This video is so cheesy.
D-Ream.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this actual video though. It is unbelievable.
Home and garden, manomano.co.uk.
2 seconds. Just let the advert play.
It's an advert.
There we go. I'm just gonna go and share the screen. I do love this, by the way, as well. And did you know there was a study done, and the period that most Britons are nostalgic for in the 1990s, apparently.
Yeah, I've seen that at the minute. Yeah.
2 seconds. So share it. Here we go.
Can only get better. Take it all from me, you know. I know that things can only get better. I sometimes lose myself in me. I lose track of time, and I can't see the woods for the trees. You set them alive, but the bridges as you go. I'm doing too far, yeah. I got my personal hell to do. Then you say, walk my path with my shoes. Talk like that, I'll be an angel and a thing. Can only get better. Can only get better. I found dreams that don't come in with a tune like that thing. Can only get better. Can only get better. Now I found you, you show me prejudice and greed, and you showed me how I must learn to deal with this disease. I look at things now. Can only get better. Can only get better. Now I found dreams that don't come in with a tune like that thing. Can only get better. Can only get better. Now I found you.
There he is.
I had to wait. I had to wait for that reveal. I had to wait. So they give you a little flash of his eye, don't they, just beforehand, just to tease you, and then it's like, bam! What a period to live in, the 1990s.
What excitement for that election. What genuine hope as well. Oh, I love that video.
Some great music from that time as well.
Yeah.
Great music. Rightio. So the episode will be up whenever. Who knows? It doesn't matter to you guys anyway, because you'll be listening to it then. Go onto Twitter and obviously vote for your winner. And there will be obviously an appearance probably on the next.
There'll be an exclusive interview. An exclusive interview with the winner.
Is there a prize, or is it just pride? We don't
respect,
mainly respect, maybe a little bit of prize as well. So yeah, good stuff. See you later, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks
You
all.
too. Enjoy your starts of term.